All right, so the relevant context for this talk really probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but as we all know, coral reefs globally are under threat from climate change and in particular ocean warming, which leads to high rates of coral bleaching, as shown here, and invariably high rates of coral mortality and coral loss. So this is a photo taken at the start of the 2016 bleaching event in the northern Great Barrier Reef, just showing the severity of this bleaching event, which ultimately, the effects of which were felt the world over. So also we've got to be cognizant of the fact that this bleaching has occurred probably at the worst possible time, if there was ever a good time for it, and it follows sustained declines in coral cover on the Great Barrier Reef over the last 50 years. So we are often somewhat preoccupied with the AIMS long-term monitoring program, providing the sort of baseline in which we assess the changes in coral cover, but we have to remember that if we look at the meta-analysis of prior coral cover estimates prior to the initiation of the long-term monitoring program, there is evidence that mean coral cover across the Great Barrier Reef was previously much higher. So we have this ongoing decline, and you can all appreciate the important consequences or ramifications of this. But for the context of this talk and for the perspective of what we've been working on of late, we've got to make this point that corals are critically important for coral reef habitats for a number of reasons. Aside from the many important services they provide in terms of contributions to primary production and carbonate deposition, they are critically important in terms of providing habitat. So losing corals, I like to say, is equivalent to clear felling rainforests. So you're taking away the major structural habitat, and we all know what the consequences of that are going to be in terms of diversity. So when we have these bleaching events, there's some of these reef fish which maintain a strong and enduring relationship with the corals, but once the corals die, invariably these associations break down. And the normal casualties that we consider in light of these sorts of disturbance events are things with a very strong and direct reliance on corals, such as these coral-dwelling damselfish. But we've known for quite a while that the effects of coral bleaching are quite widely felt. So this is a meta-analysis that we actually did 10 years ago now, looking at changes in the abundance of individual species following coral loss, and in this case mostly caused by the 1998 bleaching event. So what I'm showing here is the change in abundance of individual species averaged across 17 different studies, where they've looked at changes in abundance from 1 to 5 years following a major bleaching event. And as it's not unexpected that some of the worst affected species are the things like the coral-feeding butterfly fish, such as this obligate coral-feeding species shown up the top there, Chaetodon trifacialis, and also things like the coral-dwelling damselfish, which I showed previously. And so some of these species are experiencing 100% or 100% decline or local extinction following these major bleaching events. So when we were doing this work, the thing that really struck us is what's this going to mean for things like fisheries productivity? And at the time, we weren't really working on species which are critically important to sustaining fisheries. And so we really needed to change tack somewhat and start looking at critically important fishery species. Now, around the world, coral reefs and coral reef fisheries are critically important in sustaining the livelihoods and contributing to food security. And there are a large number of different species of reef fish that are important in sustaining these small-scale coastal fisheries. But on the Great Barrier Reef, however, our foremost target fishery species is the leopard coral groper or coral trout, shown here, Plectropomus leopardus. So the fishery for Plectropomus leopardus is somewhat complicated in the sense that it is managed to a large extent as a single species, but in terms of the stock assessment process, but the licensees are actually at liberty to target a wide range of different carnivorous species. So when we get data like this, there's a tendency to look at it in terms of just coral trout, but just remember it is the total take of the coral reef fin fish fishery. So this shows the catches through time up until 2014, which is a critical time point I'll talk about in a minute. And I'm showing this to highlight the spatial variation in the fishery as it currently stands, where you can see the different colours are coded in terms of increasing latitude. So the ones along the bottom are at the lowest latitude, and then the ones at the top are the highest latitude. And a large proportion of the fishery take does come from areas around Townsville and south of Townsville. Now you'll probably notice this somewhat obvious decline in the fisheries take coinciding with the 2004 rezoning, when there was a major restructure of this fishery to try and prevent the intensification of fishery effort in a smaller area once we closed off around 30% to fishing. So at that point, the total allowable catch was capped at approximately 70% of the maximum annual yield, giving a total annual quota of 1,200 tonnes. Now, that was the situation, as I said, right up until 2014, when there was a realisation that we needed to have a much more rigorous and focused approach to setting quotas across all of Queensland's fisheries. And so this was one of the foremost fisheries, was subject to some of these changes which are now being implemented in fisheries across the state. So what happens now is we have an annual quota which is set based on what's notionally called a stock assessment. Now, what we are attempting to do is make sure that the current exploitable biomass, or literally just the total weight of all coral trout on the reef, does not decline below 60% of what we consider the unfished biomass. So we look at this in two different ways. Firstly, at the entire Great Barrier Reef, but also just looking at those areas which are open to commercial fisheries. So in terms of just these locations, it's estimated that the unfished biomass was about 7,700 tonnes, and therefore we get this 60% level, which is the point at which we can't fall below. So based on this, we then attempt to try and work out, I'm using the we in the broader sense, I'm increasingly involved in this, and I'll explain why in a minute. But this quota, for example, is set for 2017 at just under 1,000 tonnes, and that is based on the assumption that we must be sitting somewhere here relative to our point at which we can't drop below. The thing that's not really effectively taken into account when we're doing these stock assessments is all the other factors that would potentially lead to declines in the abundance of coral trout. So we have this notional number for the non-commercial take, which is the recreational catch and also the charter fishing catch. And that's larger when you look at the entire reef area, because there's areas where there's a lot of recreational fishing on inshore reefs where the commercial fishing doesn't really occur. But what's missing from this, and I'm glad that Dave Wackenfeld made reference to this under the Queensland Harvest Strategy, is that there is no accounting whatsoever for really any major abiotic drivers of changes in coral reef, in coral trout or other fishery stocks. So we're giving just lip service at the moment to the potential impact of climate change and not really accounting for this in any meaningful way in the current harvest strategies. So is that a problem? Of course it is. And what do we do? What do we need to do to move this forward? So there is evidence that coral trout are affected by coral loss, and I'm not going to go into all the various sources of data, but this is probably one of the more easy to digest examples published by David Williamson and colleagues based on the work they were doing in the Keppel Islands, showing this covariation in the abundance of coral trout and live coral cover. So the coral trout's in blue, where you can see this interannual variation, which somewhat follows the changes in coral cover at this location. Now, in this particular case, the fluctuations in the abundance of coral trout were occurring incredibly quickly. Elsewhere where we've looked for this relationship, we see there's this fairly pronounced lag in the time to which we actually see declines in the abundance of coral trout following coral loss. So, for example, Nick Graham's study from the Seychelles for all large fishery species showed that you didn't actually see that decline for 7 to 10 years following major coral loss. So there could be fundamentally different mechanisms involved in this particular example. But When you compile all the different data that we have now, where people have gone out and looked for temporal changes in the abundance of different fish groups relative to changes in coral cover, we come up with this metric which is called standardised response, where it's the proportional change in the abundance of the fish divided by the proportional change in the coral cover. So you can get values well in excess of -1, where you get a 5-fold decline in the abundance of the fish relative to the loss of coral. Now, when you look at this, the bulk of the species shown here in these violin plots are sitting at around -1. So they're declining in direct accordance with the decline in live coral cover. Now, there's a lot of talk about winners and losers in the sense of climate change at the moment, but what we see when we look at all this is that the majority of species are actually experiencing declines in abundance. And I'll just point out, these are all the different functional groups we're using here, and the coral trout would fit into the generalist carnivores, okay? And most of the studies are showing there are declines in their abundance. So overall, 60 to 70% of fishes are lost following coral depletion or coral loss events. So there is this long tail where there are some species which experience these pronounced increases in abundance, but they do not sufficiently offset the decline in the abundance across the majority of species. So when we're talking about the decline, it's 60 to 70% decline in overall abundance as well as diversity. So not all fish are losers, but we are not seeing too many winners when it comes to large-scale major disturbances and extensive coral loss. So the question obviously is, why are coral trout affected by these declines in coral? And it's a burning question for many people working on this issue. And essentially there's two working hypotheses at the moment. The first is, and it sort of explains the time lags involved, that it may relate to a loss of recruitment habitat. So this is work that was done with Colin Wynne in conjunction with Jeff Jones, Glenn Olmany and others in the Keppel Reefs, showing that the majority of newly settled coral trout were living in live coral, but also important is this compound habitat association, where the preferred is live coral sitting on sand, just like this. This is the ideal sort of habitat for a newly settling coral trout. But the thing is when we actually looked at the potential diet availability at these same locations, it really sort of followed the same sort of pattern. So they're probably like these habitats not only because it provides important shelter from potential predators themselves, but gives them access to critically important prey at this life stage, where mostly they're feeding on benthic crustaceans such as these squat lobsters. So you can see live corals sitting over sand give them much more access to prey than any of the other habitat combinations. So at the moment, we do not have a really compelling story that we can put to fisheries to say the extent to which coral trout are going to decline in abundance following major coral loss. But the fact of the matter is that climate change poses an important and undeniable threat to this fishery. So here is just a very brief summary of all the work we're doing on the direct effects of climate change, looking at relationships between the temperature and the performance of these coral trout. So what we've got here is two different populations subject to experimental exposure to elevated temperatures here. Now, what you have to bear in mind is that for the northern population shown in orange here, the maximum summertime temperature they're normally exposed to is a mean of around 29.2 degrees. And at that point, this is where we see the optimal performance in terms of aerobic scope. But if we look at other things like spontaneous swimming speed and survivorship post-severe exposure to either aeration or chasing them around so they're under severe oxygen debt, you can see that there's declines in their survival once they get above this. So even though the thermal optima is here, fish are experiencing negative effects of elevated temperatures. And if we put this into context, in the northern Great Barrier Reef, we saw excursions above the normal long-term mean in excess of 2 degrees during 2016. So these fish are already being exposed to greatly elevated temperatures. Now, given the coral loss we're experiencing on the Great Barrier Reef, this provides an unprecedented opportunity to actually go out there and see what the effect is on coral trout. And I have to say that I'm somewhat disappointed to say that no one has taken up this opportunity. We've been looking around to try and see who's going to follow this, and it really is going to fall to the centre to do this work. So what we need to do is we need to go back into these areas which have experienced major coral loss, and we need to look at changes in the adult abundance and probably more critically the recruitment. And we also need to look at the diet and the condition of the survivors using things like stable isotopes. And this is, the real data we need to convince Queensland fisheries to actually put a climate component into those stock assessment models to actually have real traction in trying to show that there is an important link here. So just finally, it probably goes without saying that degradation and loss of coral does pose a significant threat to tropical coastal fisheries, not only in Australia but throughout the entire tropical world. And climate change is now the foremost threat to coral reef habitats and will likely have both direct and indirect effects on critical fishery species such as coral trout. Thank you.